Have you ever asked yourself why the same type of heartbreak keeps finding its way back into your life, even when you promise yourself it will never happen again? Why does it feel like you meet someone? There is strong chemistry, there is hope, there is excitement, and then slowly, without warning, they start pulling away, becoming distant, confusing, inconsistent, emotionally unavailable, and somehow you are left trying harder than ever just to feel close again? If this sounds familiar, it is not a coincidence, and it is not just bad luck in love either. There is a hidden pattern operating quietly in the background of your emotional life, a pattern so subtle that most people never notice it. But it shapes who you are attracted to, how you respond in relationships, and why certain connections feel intense at first but painful in the long run. And until this pattern becomes visible, it keeps repeating itself in different faces, different names, and different situations. But the same emotional ending. Most people think attraction is random. They think you just meet the right person at the right time. But psychology tells a different story. Human attraction is deeply connected to familiarity. Your brain is not always trying to choose what is best for you. It is trying to choose what feels known. And here is where things become complicated, because what feels known is not always what feels healthy. Sometimes what feels familiar is emotional distance. Sometimes it is inconsistency. Sometimes it is someone who is hard to reach, hard to read, and emotionally unpredictable. And if that was a part of your past experiences, even in subtle ways, your mind can start to recognize that pattern as normal, not because you want chaos, but because your nervous system confuses familiarity with safety. This is why some people repeatedly find themselves drawn to emotionally unavailable partners. Not because they enjoy being hurt, but because their internal system has learned to associate love with effort, uncertainty, and emotional chasing. And at the beginning, it never feels like a problem. In fact, it feels like excitement. It feels like chemistry. It feels like this is different. There is intense thinking, constant checking, waiting for replies, over-analyzing small changes in tone, feeling high when they are close and low when they pull away. And your mind interprets all of this emotional intensity as something meaningful. But intensity is not the same as stability, and confusion is not the same as love. The hidden pattern starts here. When someone is emotionally inconsistent, your brain does something interesting. It tries harder. It invests more energy. It becomes more focused, because uncertainty activates a psychological response that makes you seek resolution. You want clarity, you want reassurance, you want consistency, and without realizing it, you start working for it, you start proving yourself, you start adjusting yourself, you start becoming more patient, more understanding, more forgiving than you would normally be, all in the hope that things will finally stabilize. But instead of creating closeness, this often deepens the imbalance, because the more you chase, the more the dynamic shifts. One person withdraws, the other pursues, and this creates a cycle that feels emotionally consuming but strangely hard to leave. This is the hidden pattern most people never identify in real time. They think they are just trying to make it work, but in reality, they are repeating an emotional loop that is built on anxiety, hope, and temporary relief. And the hardest part is that it does not feel wrong in the beginning. It feels meaningful. It feels like effort equals love. It feels like if you just do a little more, understand a little more, wait a little longer, things will finally change. But love that requires constant chasing is not stability. It is imbalance. And here is the truth that often changes everything when it finally lands in the mind. The type of people you repeatedly attract is not just about them. It is also about what your internal system has learned to tolerate, accept, and normalize. This does not mean you are the problem. It means your emotional wiring has been shaped by experience, and anything shaped by experience can also be reshaped by awareness, because once you see the pattern clearly, something powerful happens. You can no longer participate in it unconsciously. You start noticing the early signs, the emotional distance, the inconsistency, the lack of effort, and instead of chasing it harder, something in you begins to pause. That pause is where change begins. But before you can reach that stage, you have to fully understand what this pattern is doing to your mind, your emotions, and your sense of self-worth. And if you stay with this process till the end, you will start to see something even more important. You will not only understand why avoidant partners keep appearing in your life, You will also understand how to shift your attraction pattern completely toward relationships that feel stable, secure, and emotionally safe without forcing or chasing anything. Because the goal is not just to find someone different. The goal is to become someone who no longer repeats the same emotional cycle in different forms. Why does your mind keep choosing the same emotional experience, even when your logic is screaming for something different? Why do emotionally distant people seem to enter your life with ease, while stable and consistent connections feel rare, almost difficult to maintain? There is a deeper mechanism at work here, and it is not about coincidence or simple attraction. It is about emotional conditioning, internal expectations, and unconscious selection patterns that guide who you feel drawn to long before you even realize it. Most people believe they are consciously choosing who they like. But in reality, attraction often begins before awareness. It begins in subtle emotional signals, in familiarity cues, and in the way your nervous system reacts to certain behaviors. When someone is emotionally unavailable, they often do not offer full clarity. Their attention comes in waves. Their interest feels inconsistent. One moment they are close, the next moment they are distant. This creates an unpredictable emotional environment. And unpredictability has a powerful psychological effect. The human brain is wired to seek resolution when something feels incomplete. When attention is inconsistent, your mind becomes more active, not less. It starts trying to understand, predict, and regain emotional balance. This process creates a strong mental focus on the person who is providing that inconsistency. What feels like strong attraction is often your brain trying to resolve uncertainty. This is one of the reasons emotionally unavailable individuals can feel so captivating at the beginning. They do not offer steady emotional signals. Instead, they create emotional gaps. And your mind fills those gaps with attention, interpretation, and hope. But there is another layer beneath this. Your emotional system is shaped by past experiences, not always dramatic ones, sometimes subtle ones. Moments where connection felt uncertain. Moments where attention had to be earned, moments where emotional presence was not consistently available. Over time, these experiences create an internal reference point, and that reference point becomes the standard your mind unconsciously uses to evaluate new connections. So when you meet someone who behaves in a similar emotional rhythm, your system does not see danger or mismatch. It recognizes a pattern, and recognition often feels like comfort, even when it is not beneficial. This is how repetition begins without intention. Another powerful factor is emotional investment based on scarcity. When something feels limited, your mind assigns it higher value. If someone is not fully available, your attention naturally increases. You start paying closer attention to their words, their timing, their behavior. Small moments feel significant because they are not consistent. This creates emotional overvaluation. You begin to assign importance not based on stability, but based on rarity. At the same time, emotionally secure individuals often appear very different in the beginning. They communicate clearly. They respond consistently. They do not create emotional confusion. And because your system may not be used to this type of steady presence, it can feel unfamiliar. And unfamiliar does not always register as exciting. So the mind, still influenced by older emotional coding, may overlook the stable option and gravitate toward the more stimulating one. Not because it is better, but because it activates stronger emotional responses. There is also a behavioral loop that strengthens this pattern over time. When someone is inconsistent, you tend to invest more effort to bridge the emotional distance. You become more patient, more understanding, more adaptable. And every small moment of attention from them feels rewarding. This creates a cycle of effort and reward that becomes emotionally sticky. The problem is that this cycle does not build security. It builds dependency on emotional highs and lows. The connection becomes less about mutual stability and more about managing uncertainty. Meanwhile, your self-perception slowly adjusts around this dynamic. Without realizing it, you may begin to measure your worth by how much effort you need to put in to be chosen. The more difficult the connection, the more meaningful it may feel, even if it is causing internal strain. This is where emotional attraction becomes tangled with validation. Instead of choosing people who naturally match your emotional needs, you begin leaning toward people who require you to prove those needs are valid. And over time, this reinforces the same outcome again and again. But here is something important to understand. This is not a fixed trait. It is a learned pattern of emotional response, and learned patterns can be rewritten. The first step in changing this cycle is not forcing yourself to like different people. It is becoming aware of what your mind is responding to underneath attraction. Is it consistency, or is it unpredictability? Is it peace, or is it emotional stimulation disguised as connection? Because once awareness enters the picture, the pattern loses its automatic power. You start noticing early signals more clearly. You recognize when attention is uneven. You observe when communication lacks steadiness. And instead of interpreting these signs as something to fix or improve, you begin to see them as information. This shift changes everything, because when emotional selection becomes conscious instead of automatic, you are no longer reacting from old conditioning. You are choosing from awareness. And that is where the cycle finally starts to break, not by rejecting connection, but by understanding what kind of connection actually supports emotional balance instead of disrupting it. Why does emotional distance sometimes feel more powerful than emotional presence, even when presence is what you actually need? Why does calm connection often feel unfamiliar, while unstable attention feels magnetic, almost impossible to ignore? To understand this deeper layer, you need to look at how the mind assigns meaning to emotional experiences over time. Attraction is not only shaped by who someone is, it is also shaped by how your internal system reacts to their behavior pattern. When someone gives mixed signals, your attention becomes heightened, not because the experience is healthy, but because your brain enters a state of alertness. It tries to decode what is happening. It tries to predict the next emotional moment. This creates mental engagement that feels intense and consuming, and intensity often gets misread as importance. In contrast, when someone is steady and predictable, your system does not need to work. There is no decoding, no guessing, no emotional puzzle to solve. The experience feels smoother, but also less stimulating at first. This difference creates a confusion between emotional activation and emotional value. Your nervous system tends to remember what activates it more strongly. So when inconsistency has been a repeated pattern in your experiences, it can start to feel like the default version of connection. Anything outside of that pattern may feel unusually quiet or even unfamiliar. This is where many people make a silent misinterpretation. They assume that if something does not create emotional turbulence, it must lack depth. But in reality, depth is not always loud. Sometimes it is quiet, stable, and consistent. Another important factor is how effort gets interpreted as emotional significance. When connection is difficult, the mind tends to assign it higher meaning. Struggle creates a sense of importance. The more effort required, the more value is perceived. This is a psychological bias that can distort decision-making in relationships. It shifts focus away from emotional compatibility and toward emotional challenge. As a result, a person may become more invested in connections that require constant emotional adjustment. They may start believing that real connection must be earned through persistence, and if something feels easy, it may be dismissed too quickly. But this belief slowly builds emotional exhaustion, because effort without balance creates strain over time. The mind remains active, always trying to stabilize something that never fully settles. At the same time, there is another subtle process happening internally. When you invest heavily in someone who is inconsistent, your mind begins to justify that investment. It tries to protect your emotional effort by creating meaning around it. This can lead to deeper attachment, even when the experience is not fulfilling. The connection becomes tied not just to feelings, but to time, energy, and emotional investment already given. This makes letting go more difficult because it feels like losing more than just a person. It feels like losing all the effort that was already invested. Meanwhile, stable individuals may not trigger this same emotional investment process. Because there is no emotional chase, the attachment builds differently. It is slower, more grounded, and less dependent on highs and lows. However, if your internal reference point is still shaped by unpredictability, this stability may not immediately register as strong attraction. It may feel neutral or even slightly underwhelming at first. This is where many people unknowingly reject what is actually healthy for them, not because it is wrong, but because it does not activate the same emotional patterns they are accustomed to. Another layer to understand is emotional self-concept. Over time, repeated experiences of inconsistency can shape how you see your own value in relationships. You may begin to associate love with proving yourself, adjusting yourself, or waiting longer than necessary for clarity. This internal belief can quietly influence your choices. It can make you more tolerant of situations where emotional clarity is delayed. It can also make you more likely to interpret inconsistency as something that can eventually improve with enough patience. But this creates a loop where your emotional needs are continuously postponed, and when emotional needs are not met consistently, internal tension builds. You may feel anxious without fully understanding why. You may feel preoccupied with the connection even when nothing is actively happening. This is the mind trying to resolve unfinished emotional patterns. Breaking this cycle requires a shift in how emotional signals are interpreted. Instead of focusing on intensity, attention needs to shift toward consistency. Instead of measuring emotional value by how strongly something feels, it needs to be measured by how steadily it exists. This change is not immediate. It happens gradually as awareness strengthens. At first, old patterns will still appear attractive. But with repetition of awareness, the reaction begins to slow down. There is a gap between trigger and response. That gap is where choice becomes possible. In that space, you are no longer pulled automatically into emotional pursuit. You can observe behavior without immediate attachment. You can recognize inconsistency without trying to fix it. You can see emotional imbalance without becoming emotionally absorbed in it. And slowly, the internal attraction pattern begins to reorganize itself. What once felt magnetic starts to feel unstable. What once felt confusing starts to feel unnecessary. And what once felt unfamiliar starts to feel more aligned. This is the beginning of emotional recalibration, not by forcing new preferences, but by allowing your system to unlearn what it mistakenly treated as connection and relearn what actually supports emotional steadiness. Why does emotional imbalance feel so gripping, even when it slowly drains your inner peace? Why do moments of uncertainty in connection leave a stronger impact on your mind than moments of clarity? To understand this, you need to look at how the brain stores emotional experiences tied to reward and discomfort. The human mind does not only respond to pleasure, it also responds strongly to unpredictability. When emotional rewards are inconsistent, the mind becomes more alert, more focused, and more engaged. This creates a powerful loop where attention increases not because of stability, but because of unpredictability. When someone gives attention in irregular patterns, your internal system starts waiting. It begins scanning for signals. It becomes sensitive to small changes in communication, timing, and behavior. Every slight shift feels meaningful because the pattern is not steady. This heightened sensitivity can create the illusion of emotional depth, but in reality, it is a state of constant anticipation. Over time, this anticipation becomes habit-forming. The mind starts associating emotional intensity with significance. It begins to believe that the more it has to wait, the more valuable the connection must be. This is where perception becomes distorted. Instead of recognizing emotional consistency as the foundation of trust, the mind begins to associate emotional unpredictability with importance. This is not a conscious decision. It is a learned response formed through repeated exposure. Another important aspect is how emotional reinforcement works. When attention is unpredictable, each moment of closeness feels like a reward. These moments stand out more sharply because they are not frequent. This contrast creates strong emotional memory. The brain remembers contrast more than continuity, so inconsistent interactions often leave deeper impressions than steady ones. But these impressions are not always aligned with emotional well-being. They are simply stronger in memory due to contrast. As this pattern continues, emotional investment can become disproportionate. A person may start to give more significance to small signs of attention than to the overall quality of the connection. This shifts focus away from stability and toward momentary validation. At this stage, emotional balance becomes difficult to maintain. The internal experience begins to fluctuate based on external responses. A single message can change the emotional state. A delay can create doubt. A small interaction can create temporary relief. This creates emotional dependency on external behavior patterns. Meanwhile, secure connection operates differently. It does not rely on emotional spikes. It builds gradually through steady interaction. There is no need to interpret hidden meanings or analyze fluctuations. The experience is more predictable and because of that, less emotionally reactive. However, if the internal system is accustomed to high emotional variability, this steadiness can feel unfamiliar. The absence of emotional turbulence may even be misread as lack of interest or depth. This misinterpretation is one of the reasons stable relationships are sometimes overlooked in early stages. Another layer to consider is internal emotional calibration. When someone repeatedly experiences inconsistency, their baseline for emotional normal shifts. What once felt uncomfortable may start to feel acceptable. What once felt too unstable may begin to feel normal. This adjustment happens gradually without awareness. It becomes part of emotional expectation. Because of this shift, the mind may naturally gravitate toward familiar emotional patterns, even if those patterns create discomfort in the long term. Familiarity often overrides logic in emotional decision-making. At the same time, effort begins to play a symbolic role in attraction. When emotional connection requires persistence, the mind can interpret persistence as proof of value. The idea forms that if something is difficult to maintain, it must be meaningful. But difficulty in connection is not always a sign of depth. Often, it is a sign of imbalance in emotional availability. This misunderstanding can lead to prolonged emotional investment in situations that do not provide mutual steadiness. The more effort is invested, the harder it becomes to step away, because emotional energy has already been deeply committed. This creates a psychological attachment not only to the person, but to the effort itself. Letting go then feels like discarding time, emotion, and personal investment. This makes the emotional loop even stronger. Meanwhile, stable connection does not trigger the same psychological commitment pattern. Because there is no emotional struggle, there is less resistance, but also less attachment based on effort. This can initially feel less intense, even though it offers greater emotional security. The challenge lies in retraining emotional interpretation. It requires learning to recognize that calm does not mean absence of feeling, it means absence of instability. It requires understanding that consistency is not boring, but regulated. As awareness develops, emotional responses begin to change. Instead of reacting strongly to unpredictability, there is increased observation. Instead of chasing clarity, there is patience for behavior patterns to reveal themselves. Instead of assigning value to emotional highs, attention shifts toward long-term emotional steadiness. This transformation is subtle but powerful. Over time, emotional triggers lose their automatic control. The urge to pursue inconsistency weakens, the need for validation through unpredictability reduces, and the mind begins to appreciate stability without resistance. This is not about suppressing emotion. It is about refining emotional perception. And as perception changes, attraction begins to shift naturally. What once felt compelling starts to lose its grip. What once felt confusing starts to feel unnecessary. And what once felt normal starts to feel misaligned. This marks a deeper change in internal emotional structure, where connection is no longer defined by intensity, but by balance, clarity, and mutual presence.